Hi, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon session of Cyberweek. And also, Charlie has just joined. Good to see you here, my friend. And you got the hang loose floating too. So I do appreciate that. So very excited about this conversation today. It's going to be with Charlie and with Dan and me and Ayelet. And I think our friend Jan is going to be joining in a few minutes too. But we intend for this to be very collaborative and be a friendly, open conversation. I'm sure everybody has their hands on slightly different parts of the elephant in terms of how artificial intelligence is transforming mediation. But Dan, can I ask you to kind of kick us off a little bit? I mean, you wrote the book on the fourth party, so I think you can do a great job kind of setting a common frame and maybe kicking us off and giving us some things to think about as we talk together.
Well, I'm happy to kick it off. Yeah, as my colleagues would normally expect, I come from a little bit of a left field, but we'll see where it goes. And I will actually focus a little bit on the notion of third party, fourth party, because I think that's if you're not talking about the technology per se, the relationships I think are going to be very interesting as we add AI to the mix going forward. So if we look back a bit, say to the 1980s, when in the U.S. anyway, the ADR movement really was sort of ingrained into not only government work here, but began to be ingrained in the courts, and mediation began to be more commonly thought of as a way to deal with conflict. There's always been mediation in every culture. Every culture has always had some way to bring in a trusted third party to help solve conflict. But in the 80s in the US, you began to get almost a codification of the notion of the third party function. And so you have this idea of the neutral third party. And of course, we can never be neutral. But the real thing is you can never be a neutral influence. When you bring that third party, as we defined it, into the mix, you're changing the dynamic with the individuals who are there, and you're changing the dynamic of the process itself. And so if you move along a little bit and into around 2000, 2001, whenever Ethan and Janet wrote the book and coined the term fourth party, the notion of fourth party was a rather modest notion at the beginning. And I've said that in writing before, and Ethan actually agreed with me, that really what we were talking about in the early days of ODR was the fourth party as an influence on the process and an influence on the parties at the table, but not going so far as to think about it as taking up third-party functions. And so if you look at the notion of ODR from, say, 2000, 2001 up to COVID, it's the process of adding technology, sometimes almost as a co-mediator, but not really fully as a co-mediator, but bringing in technology to do some of the functions that we do as third parties. The real change that I see that's happening now that I think is going to be unsettling to some people and thrilling to some people is that if you mix AI into this whole notion of the third party, fourth party relationship, you really have a fourth party, a technology party that can act almost as a co-mediator. They can pick up some of the real functions of the third party as we've traditionally defined the third party. And as you move forward, it's already happening in some places that the fourth party is becoming the third party. And so that's interesting to me in the sense that we're moving in a direction where the technology is going to be picking up the functions and picking up the place of the person that we thought about always as the third party. And that's an interesting switch. But even more interesting to me, Colin, and I think you've mentioned this before as well, is that as we do that, as we add this very capable fourth party into the work that we do as third parties, we are inevitably going to change the way we think about the process.
Absolutely.
It's going to give us the way to do things that we can't do or we couldn't do, and it's going to influence us. Again, it's not going to be a neutral influence. It's going to influence both the third parties who work, but it's also going to influence the process in which we work. And so I think that's, if we're looking on the horizon, I think we ought to be looking for those things to happen. And as I said, that will scare the hell out of some people and it'll excite other people.
That's 100%. I mean, Dan, I know you and I have talked about this. I think we talk about how mediation is changing technology, right? We have, I mean, that's what ODR.com is doing. That's what ADR Notable is doing. That's what all these companies are doing. We're trying to build technology shaped by our understanding of mediation. But it's also true that technology is changing mediation. I mean, we saw that through the pandemic. Zoom mediation was a pretty rare event, prior to the pandemic. Now, the majority of mediations are taking place online, with face-to-face becoming the exception. And what we're seeing is it's fundamentally changing the mediation process. I was excited at the beginning to use breakout rooms in my online mediations. Now my understanding is people aren't using breakout rooms because you can do lots of short sessions. You can have a 30-minute conversation with everybody and say, why don't we take a break? And then, why don't we jump on and I'll do a call with, party A. There's no reason to put somebody in a breakout room and make them wait. So we're all experimenting. Yeah, please.
I was just going to say there are a couple of things that I think are really, really significant about what you're talking about. One of them is the notion of time. We have, again, going back to the beginnings of ADR in the US anyway, we're talking about a compacted time period where you bring people together, you put everybody at the table, the physical table, and you stay there till you get it done. And the more we've integrated technology into what we do, the more we have been able to bend the notion of time.
Absolutely.
And with an AI system, you can actually blow time completely apart in terms of how we think about the sequencing of the things that we do.
That's right. So time and space, right? Geographic distance is no longer a barrier in access.
Yeah, it's a really exciting thing to me.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting, and Richard Susskind talked about this in his book, Online Courts and the Future of Justice. He said, you can look at the practicality of whether or not AI is able to do the things we are asking it to do, because it's going to become more powerful over time. Actually, John Zletnikov in the last session that I was just in, he said, look, the technology behind AI has not really fundamentally changed in the last 20 years. But the power of computers and the ability to store enormous amounts of information has been growing exponentially. And that has increased, in turn, the power of AI. So now we're going to have quantum computing. We're going to have the singularity. I mean, it's amazing to think about the computing power that we're going to have at our disposal in 3, 5, 7 years. And that's going to supercharge all of these mechanisms to make them even more effective. So, please. No, what were you saying?
One more quick thing, and I'll shut up and let somebody else talk. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting to me is that one of the things that I preached very early on about the efficacy of ODR was that it can create a safe space in a way that you cannot create if you're in a room, locked in a room together across a table, a physical table.
That's right.
And I think because technology has become so ingrained in our society, because we are so used to using technology, so we are so used to interacting with the machine, for lack of a better way to say it, I think that increases the definition of what a safe space can look like.
Right.
Safe space may be that I'm not interacting with a human being. I'm interacting with a machine that I feel safer interacting with than I feel interacting with.
Absolutely.
I think I see this in other cases, not just in mediation, but in other social interaction situations, especially with younger people who have never had a world where they didn't have the ability to interact with machines.
Absolutely, and are much more comfortable with the idea of interacting with an algorithm. I just let me finish the point I was making about Richard Susskind, which is he talks about, is AI ready? Is the technology ready to deliver these services? That's an important question. But the other question he talks about is society ready? Are people ready for this? Because it may be that the technology is here, it's ready to rock and roll, but the people are just so creeped out by it that they don't want to use it. And it's going to take time for these norms to settle in. But what's amazing is just watching this happening in real time. I mean, ChatGPT, we're only about a year in to ChatGPT 3.5. Now we have ChatGPT 4. Now they're talking about ChatGPT 5. Now we have Claude. Now we have Bard. Now we have Llama. We have all these AIs that are just cropping up all over the place. And it's amazing in real time to see the attitude of people change about the role. And so what you said, Dan, is very interesting. We had a lot of hand wringing in the dispute resolution field for years about neutrality, because when I was first trained in the late 80s, they said, we got to be neutral. You got to be neutral. And people said, well, you can't be neutral. No human is neutral. It's like to even pretend you're neutral is to mislead the parties, because everybody has an opinion. So now we'd say, well, let's not be neutral. Let's be impartial. It feels like a little lower bar. Now I hear mediators talking more about being omnipartial. So it's not that I don't have a side, it's that I'm on everybody's side. Everybody wants to get an agreement. So I'm on everybody's side in trying to get that agreement. But I think one of the things we didn't reckon with is the potential for the fourth party and AI to be more credibly neutral than we are as people. Because if you're sitting in the room as a human, people are looking at your face and looking at your reactions and looking at your eyebrows and looking at your tone of voice and constantly making, micro assumptions about where your sympathies may lie. And it's very interesting to see parties now say, well, let's just see what the fourth party says. Let's ask the AI. Let's submit. I think, again, in the prior session, Claire talked about a mediation where two parties were arguing about whether or not a statement that one of them made was aggressive. And then they said, well, let's just ask the fourth party. So they gave it to ChatGPT. Is this an aggressive statement? And ChatGPT said, yes, that could be interpreted as an aggressive statement. So again, it's almost like the referee, this fourth party role, especially once we get to the point where we're not going to be asking the public Bard or Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude. We're going to be able to create unique, confidential instances of these LLMs that we can go in and we can share the information. It's a blank slate other than what we've provided. And then we say, what do you think? What are your takeaways? What are some of the observations you'd make? And I think increasingly, we're going to find that our parties want that. It's not even that they assent to us doing it. They're going to come in saying, I expect to be able to use that in this process because I'm using it in every area of my life. So what do you think about that, Dan?
I think you're absolutely right. And it also brings up for me one of the big caveats that I think we need to pay attention to. There's a publication that Stanford did quite recently looking at the transparency of the top 10 AI programs that are out there available to the public.
Yeah.
And the best score out of 100 in transparency was a 54.
Wow.
So I think you're also absolutely correct that we're going to find targeted AI programs and LLMs that deal with labor arbitration or pick your topic area. It doesn't matter.
Sure.
And I think as we see those coming on the market, I think we ought to be very mindful of the fact that they should be transparent enough so that we know when we're asking that so-called neutral party for an opinion that it is in fact likely to be more neutral than we are.
Yeah.
Know how it was built and what it learned on. That's the caveat that I have in the back of my mind is like, this is great stuff. It's really, really powerful. Mm-hmm. It isn't a neutral influence. And we need to understand where it comes from, just like we need to understand where a person's coming from.
Yeah, I don't think AI is going to hit scale in dispute resolution or even in legal tech more broadly until it can show its work, until it's got radical transparency. I think, and it's not going to become the default choice the way that sort of, Zoom mediation became the default choice. It can't just be as good. I think it has to be demonstrably better. And I think we're going to get there. And that's when we're going to really hit the tipping point. All right, well, let me widen the circle. Dan, you and I could talk all day, but Ayelet, I want to bring you in too, because I know about your research that you did. I mean, you were saying that it's a little old at this point, but it was amazing how prescient you were in designing this experiment at Stanford years back, because it had to do with perceptions of parties when they were negotiating against live people versus agents. So I was just wondering if you could characterize a little of that and then maybe connect it to all of the stuff that's happening now with ChatGPT and these LLMs and all of that.
Thanks, Colin. So first of all, I think it's really important when we're having this conversation not to just say online mediation, because there are actually a lot of different variants of online mediation. And you mentioned earlier that I guess nowadays, especially post the pandemic, when people are saying online mediation, they're referring to Zoom mediations or video conferencing. But for many years prior to the pandemic, when people were saying online mediation, they were largely referring to a completely different process, usually a very lean, text-based, asynchronous process that was happening on, form-based or questionnaire-based online dispute resolution platforms. Mm-hmm. And so, first of all, I just want to put it out there that we should likely make that distinction. In a new article that will be coming out, Ordner Rabinovich, Amy, and I call this the techno-procedural design of different online dispute resolution platforms, when we are arguing explicitly and also showing some research, some empirical research showing that people have different experiences and they behave differently based on the design of the platform, the design of the process. And of course, we can say the same thing about the use of video conferencing in mediation and in arbitration and in adjudication, because the legal rules and the dynamics of the process are different. So just first of all, as an initial point, I want to say when we're talking about the use of technology in dispute resolution, and specifically also the use of AI in dispute resolution and even in mediation, we should be making different statements or different analysis based on the specific techno-procedural design of the process.
Ayelet, if you don't mind, because I want to just say something about that before you move on to the next point, which I'm sure is equally interesting. This is definitely, I'm hearing this a lot these days. The definition of ODR we used for years was just ODR is technology plus dispute resolution. And I think Jean Sternlight wrote, she said at the Williamsburg conference, she said, well, that's not a definition. You can't just, that's everything. Just if it's technology is involved in every process now. So is it all ODR? So I think we're getting better at defining that. I think Chris and Leah wrote a great piece before Edinburgh. They was sort of talking about the spectrum, where you have one side where there's no technology, it's just people, and the other side is all technology. I think Amy Schmitz, I see, is increasingly doing a presentation where she talks about in the loop. Is technology in the loop? Is it out of the loop? So I think we have to get much more better at describe. I love this techno-procedural design. And Merez asked to read the article. Is it published yet, or is it in
No. So it's still a draft, but hopefully we'll get it by the end of the year in a shareable format. So yeah, we'll be happy to circulate it.
And I think Jan and Amy are doing a book now on ODR and dispute systems design. So I think it feels to me like there's a richer conversation that's happening now where we can try and come up with a better way to understand. Because I agree with you, it drives me crazy when people say, oh yeah, I do ODR. Sure, I've got a filing form. Or, I send out a text notification when somebody needs to dial in. It's like, okay, but we painted ourselves into that corner by having an overly broad definition. So I think we need to get a little bit more specific. So I applaud you and Orna for taking that initiative.
Yeah, and I just think even, if we don't get into the argument of, what are the contours of ODR and does a certain process fall within the umbrella of ODR, even when we are just discussing, well, what's the impact of having AI in mediation? It wouldn't be the same for every type of mediation, because we have to contextualize it. We have to contextualize it by the type of process. A mediator using an AI decision support tool or analytical tool is not the same as a completely autonomous, kind of like what Dan was saying earlier, a completely autonomous AI mediator in a lean text-based process. These are not apples and apples. So I'm just making this preliminary point to sort of alert everyone as we're talking about, is AI mediation a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How does it impact the process?
Yeah, what does that even mean?
We can't talk in these generic terms. We have to be very specific and contextualized. And I think that's also the point. Jan is not here yet, but I'm sure she would agree that that's a big realization of the dispute system design framework and this analytical tool that we now have, that we have to be very context specific, because otherwise we're just saying things.
Now, I cut you off, so please make your second point.
So having said that, the research that I conducted is in a completely different context. So it's not Zoom mediations. It's a lean text-based asynchronous process set in an e-commerce setting. So this is an important context also because of the value of the dispute, which was somewhat lower. And I mentioned that because I think a big piece of how people experience interaction with AI agents in every domain has to do with their expectations of that interaction. So in that specific experiment, I actually found that when we're in the context of a consensual process, so mediation, where parties have control over the final outcome, they had very positive perceptions of the AI mediators. In fact, they perceived the AI mediator more favorably than they did a perceived human mediator operating such a lean text-based mediation interface.
Now, when you say more favorably, does that mean more fairly, or just what does favorably mean?
Right. So I use different metrics of procedural justice as my primary measures. Procedural justice is a very widely accepted metric for evaluating the procedural experiences of participants in dispute resolution processes. It includes different indicators. One is the perceived ability to participate in the process, so the opportunity to express one's views. Another is the perceived respectful treatment by the mediator, the perceived neutrality of the mediator. So we have different indicators that comprise this concept of procedural justice. I guess in colloquial term, it's basically how fair was the process experience, but we academics like to break it down into smaller fractions. So on most of these metrics, the AI mediator was perceived more favorably than the human mediator, again, in that context of an e-commerce dispute and a text-based lean process, right?
Fascinating, yeah.
And what was interesting is that when we turned into arbitration, again, using the exact same settings, the exact same interface, but now we have a perceived arbitrator who's human, or a perceived or an arbitrator who's perceived to be AI, the trend was different. So the results weren't as overwhelming. There were less differences between how people experienced a human arbitrator and an AI arbitrator, but there were some very significant differences, and that was on the perception of the arbitrator's trustworthiness and respectfulness. Okay, and the sense of voice. So here, even though everything was completely standardized, once the dispute resolution neutral had the power to make a determination on the outcome of the case, people preferred a human arbitrator. Okay, so that's interesting. When the AI was used in an assistive capacity, so in mediation, but the parties retained their power, their control over the outcome, and they liked it. They liked having the AI as their mediator. But when it flipped and there was really the power or the authority to make the determination in the case, they preferred a human arbitrator. Now, I remind everyone that this is an experimental setting, so everything was standardized. The outcome was identical. So it's really just the perception of people about the process. I should also say that this is an experiment that's 10 years old. It will be very interesting to repeat this kind of experiment nowadays. Sure. I mean, really, the landscape has changed. You know, our experience interacting with AI agents has evolved considerably. I'm not sure that we will be able to replicate the findings. I haven't done this yet. I have not repeated the experiment, but this is also an important caveat.
Well, so we have our hands around the nub of a very interesting thesis here, hypothesis for us to test. And I didn't expect this when we came into the conversation, but you know, I think back to all the conversations we had about AI prior to ChatGPT, you know, prior to this LLM, you know, era that we're in. And obviously, Ayelet, your experiments took place in that prior era. But we had lots of conversations about, you know, we have to ensure that AI is always under human supervision because there's such a high risk that the AI is going to be biased. And there was all this talk about machine learning algorithms going in and, you know, getting biased data and training on that data and then replicating that bias at scale. So Leah, I want to bring you into the conversation. You just asked a great question about regulation, but I want to put a different question to you, and then maybe we can head in the direction of that question. You know, I know when we redid the iCoder standards and we put in more about AI, I look at standard number 5, equal. One of the things that you know, we the royal we, but I'm guessing it was either you or Dan or somebody who was actually working on it, put this in. But we say ODR systems design must include proactive efforts to prevent any artificial intelligence decision-making function from creating, replicating, or compounding bias in process or outcome. And human oversight is required in ODR system design and auditing to identify bias, make findings transparent to ODR providers and users, and eliminate bias in ODR processes and outcomes. And the interesting thing, I did not foresee this prior to the ChatGPT revolution or the LLM revolution, but maybe Ayelet identified the seed of this with her experimentation. And this is what I feel like Dan was talking about too. Might we get to a point where people actually trust the AI to be more unbiased than the third party. And then this notion that the humans have to watch the AI to ensure it's not biased, maybe it's going to be flipped on the head, and then we need the AI to monitor the humans to identify the bias. I mean, I'm not sure if we're there yet, but it's interesting to me. The last thing I'll say is when we were in Montreal, there was a grad student, one of Kareem's grad students, who showed a platform that you were text messaging back and forth, and if somebody said something that was interpreted as being aggressive, like kind of threatening or menacing or something, the LLM was reading all of this in real time but not saying anything. And then if a message that was it read a proposed message and it detected that tone, it would pop up a box that said, "Hey, FYI, we think that this message may be interpreted the other side as an aggressive message. Here it is redrafted. We redrafted the message to take that tone out. Substantively, it says the same thing. Would you prefer to use this message or use your prior message, the message that you wrote?" And I thought, my initial reaction was, well, that's creepy. If I was a party, it's just bossy to have an LLM come in and say, "Hey, did you really mean what you said you mean?" But it's almost a little bit like Word, where if you type a sentence into passive construction or you mistype a word, it just goes through and it corrects these things for you. And I wonder if the norm will emerge where we will expect to have these LLMs kind of benevolently watching us and nudging us based on what they perceive to be in our own self-interest. And we will trust the neutrality of those algorithms, maybe for good reason or maybe foolishly because we haven't really done the research. But and then the parties will expect that kind of benevolent pushing through the process. So anyway, it's an unformed thought, but Leah, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I'm curious to hear your reaction.
All right, I'll try to weigh in very briefly since I'm not on the panel, but thank you for inviting me into the conversation. Colin, I guess a couple of things. One, I would say, I really appreciate that you're naming that there may be a way we could purposefully harness AI to help address human bias. Now, how that plays out, how we can include that in our training or in our ODR platforms, the kind of tools that we offer, that sounds exciting and potentially valuable. And then I will also say that I think populations that have been at the brutal end of data bias and inequality in how data is managed will have the highest risk in many ways when we use AI with big data to try to generalize what is considered aggressive, what is considered conflict, what is considered worrisome. And I think that that's something for us to consider. How are we in many ways using AI to speak to majority culture in every society, but in many ways, Western culture and also dominant cultures. And so I guess I would say the most important thing may be choice and transparency. But that's why I brought up the issue of regulation. I think it's complicated. I'd love to hear some of the panelists' views. But I think if someone had the ability to click and say, "I'd like machine learning to give me guidance," and then I have a choice about that. And if someone didn't want that, they could choose not to. So those are some of my thoughts. I think that we ought to be worried that so far we have not eliminated bias in AI, and yet now we're putting an accelerator on it.
Yeah, one of the things, again, this prior session that I just did, Claire gave an example of if you go to DALL-E and you say, "Show me a picture of 5 mediators," she said, "It's probably going to be white men." So I actually went into DALL-E in real time, the new one that's in ChatGPT they just released, and I said, "Show me a picture of 5 mediators." And it actually gave me it was a cartoon, but it gave me men and women and gender diversity or ethnic diversity. Now it was a drawing, and they were all sitting around a table. So it's interesting. My friend, who many of us share, Zev Eigen, who's an expert on debiasing data, he's worked in the employment context. He said the beauty of AI, the beauty of artificial intelligence, machine learning, is that it's data. We can evaluate it and we can train it. And if we see that it has bias, we can go in and identify that bias and we can try and rectify it. Whereas a lot of the bias in humans, you can't a lot of it's implicit bias. The individuals don't even realize that they're harboring that bias. So we know that people of color get 30% worse outcomes from the court system, and it's been that way for 50 years. And there's been many attempts to try and fix it, but where does that bias live? And it's hard to change the behavior of individuals if they don't even acknowledge that they harbor that bias in the first place. So I guess I'm not gonna, I can be a little bit of a techno optimist here sometimes, you know, so I don't want to be cavalier about, well, you know, once it's all in data, we can just go fix the problem. But I do think that it's getting better. Like we can go in and we can monitor these things. The other thing that was just said in the prior session, I'm interested in your reaction, this gets to your regulation question, is there were some people from family courts, because this was the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. They said, we're so sick of co-parents who are so mad at each other, getting into these online forums and just yelling at each other and saying hurtful, hateful things because they're trying to provoke the other side. They said, we want an AI that will prevent that kind of communication. That if parties come in and they start yelling at each other and saying aggressive things, that the AI either won't allow the communication or will aggressively reframe it to make it respectful. So that was a little bit too far for me. I was like, wait a minute. So the AI is going to come in and police all this content and make sure that nothing hurtful or hateful is said between the parties to a divorce? I mean, are people going to feel so constrained by that? Or are we just going to start to accept it? Like, you know, this is a forum where we don't allow that kind of communication, and the LLM is going to play kind of the enforcer police role. And maybe if it does sense a communication that's biased or that's hurtful or hateful, or it might be interpreted in a certain way, it says, hey, you need to reframe this because, you know, this needs to be taken out. So, you know, I worry sometimes we go too far in the other direction. So even I started to have a moment of pause there. Dan, I see your hands up. What did you want to say?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll do Dan and then we'll go to Ayelet. Oh, Dan, you're on mute.
Go ahead and take Ayelet, because my question is going to
take us in a different direction. Okay, Ayelet, please. What did you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to also say that I think we should be wary of having too much techno-optimism about what these systems can and cannot do. And a big part of it has to do with the different capacities and capabilities of people coming into the process. And so in order to be able to judge whether an AI system is biased or is producing erroneous decision, you need to have a certain degree of competence, of expertise. You need to be able to, know how to detect these kind of issues. And that's oftentimes not the case. We oftentimes have power imbalances between parties using these tools. I worry about the tech competency of mediators who are using these tools that are not necessarily able to identify instances where the AI is producing predictions that are biased or products that are biased in a particular way. And I think that we have an institutional systematic challenge here, which is these, and that goes back to what Zev was saying and what John Zalesnikov was saying earlier. I mean, these systems are based on data, lots of data that someone has created algorithms to produce insights out of. Not everyone has access to this data. Not anyone can, replicate or, generate similar access to similar data in order to vet the outcomes that these AI software are generating. And as long as we have that, I mean, I don't think we can really say that any AI tool is guaranteed to be neutral, or that we are able to provide sufficient oversight to the output that it produces. And so I think that the conversation needs to start with, having some recognition of the capabilities of the people that are using it, our ability to provide safeguards, oversight. To what extent do we need to worry about power imbalances and how they're actually enhanced by the use of these systems or access to these systems? Mm-hmm. And I would like to see more of the conversation go there, both in terms of regulation, but also just practice, the way that these systems are integrated now into existing online mediation services, or even as outside tools. And I know Leah, for example, has written some about Otter AI, which we have now running at the background of this session.
Right, transcribing.
Transcribing, but it's not just transcribing, right? Something can be done with this data, right? Once we have this stored, as data that is analyzable. Say that we were a mediation session, and say that we are a repeat player who can now have a complete record of the entire dynamic of this conversation. And let's say that we're a corporation and we're having these kind of mediations with a bunch of our clients or consumers. And over time, we are able to fully predict the dynamic of different mediation sessions and then adjust our behavior accordingly, thanks to our amazing AI tool that we have implemented on this, seemingly neutral transcription of the session. So, I mean, I think there's really a larger conversation here. It's not just about how accurate the AI tool is. It's also about what kind of disparities it produces and what kind of access people have to it.
Mm-hmm. Dan, what did you want to say?
Oh, well, a couple of things, actually. One is that just coming off the comments that were just made, if you look at the development of dispute resolution generally, how do new or inexperienced practitioners figure out what works and what doesn't work and what's good and what's not good? And the way we've done that in the past is there have been people who are capable of figuring out and have made their own mistakes and have learned a little bit of wisdom who pass along that information. And I think that's going to happen to some degree with the use of AI. There are going to have to be people who are competent to say, that's a good system, that one's not a good system. That one has problems, this one has fewer problems. And we're going to have to rely to some degree on people who are competent to make those determinations, who teach the rest of us. But that's sort of a side note. What I really wanted to talk about, and we can get back to that if you want to, is Chuck made a comment earlier on that I think is interesting, and I have an opinion about it, but I would like to hear your opinion and some other opinions too before I say anything. And that is, if AI is so freaking wonderful, and we're so optimistic as you are, Colin, that AI is going to offer all this stuff, what is it that a human third party has to offer in the face of expanding AI?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I have a lot of opinions about that. I'll tell you, I was doing a lot of talking about AI lately, and I obviously John Zalewski just made this, told the story in the last thing. So I think lots of people are thinking about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and this computer deep thought that they made, and they asked, "What's the answer to life, the universe, and everything?" They wait 10,000 years, and it says 42, and they're like, "What? What does that mean?" And he says, "Well, I can't explain it to you, but the answer is 42." And I do think that it names a dynamic with these AIs. You know, if you can create a machine learning mechanism that can read 1 million court cases in 16 different languages, and you bring in your landlord-tenant dispute, and it says, you know, I want to get my security deposit back, and this AI says, well, you know, 42. Like, there's no buy-in. So I do think that we have to have AIs that can show their work a little bit, because it'll give us more of a procedural legitimacy. So we can go in and say, well, why is it 42? Okay, here's the explanation. It evaluated this evidence. It evaluated that evidence. Here's some court cases that it applied. It'll have a little bit more weight. But this is what Jean Sternlight says when she, you know, pours a little psychological cold water on ODR. You know, there's a psychological journey that people go through. And you can have the most powerful computer in the world that says, this party needs to pay that party $136.28. But if you haven't gone through the journey of getting, you know, feeling heard, feeling connected, feeling, you know, some sort of opportunity to have someone listen to what you went through and, you know, empathize, I think that that's where the third party is essential. And it doesn't matter how powerful the AIs get. I mean, they talk about, oh, we're going to build little happy robots, and, you know, they'll be able to flirt with you and, you know, emote at you. I think that's way farther off, you know, than having the AIs chew on all the data and give us an output. That's where I think people say that technology was, in the 80s, there was this whole stereotype that the technology is going to dehumanize us and turn us into like androids, you know, like Devo and Kraftwerk. And the opposite has happened. Technology has made us messier and more human, because it's taken all of that administrative math and ones and zeros, and it handles that. And now we just focus on the psychological messiness of being people. And I think that that's where the third party lives. I think we are, the human component of the dispute resolution process is going to live in the third party. And more, the administrative math crunching part is going to get shifted to the fourth party. But I don't think that I don't think that humans are going to become incidental to mediation anytime soon. If anything, we're going to be able to focus on the stuff that most requires our humanity. So that's my swing.
I agree with that. And for me, I think about it in terms of where we are now and where we're going with AI as well. Where we are now with AI is, even though the universes that we're dealing with in AI's learning are huge, they're still reasonably bounded. You can have a million cases. Take an organization that has a history going back a century of kinds of decisions that they've made, and you put all of that into a learning position for AI. That's really great. But one of the things that in my career, what I've done is I've dealt with really messy cases,
Right.
cases that are weird, and sometimes the solutions that we come up with are not things that would normally have been in the universe of possibility before we started.
Oh yeah.
It's weird. They just come out of left field and they're strange, but they work and people like them and we go forward with them. And that, it seems to me, is something that right now the AI that we're dealing with doesn't do very well, because it's going to be interpreting reality, interpreting the world based on the data set that you give it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to take a sidestep and go into another complete universe and say, hey, how about this? Bring this weird thing in. We're going to get there with AI. That's going to happen, but I don't think it's there yet. I think it's one of the things we still offer as human beings is we can think of weird stuff. We can think off the wall.
Well, what is it Ben says? He said, confuse the algorithm, if they give you line paper, write diagonally. Like, you just have to behave in unpredictable ways. I mean, I had a mediation at eBay where these two people had gone after each other for 10 months over this motorcycle part that, and they filed escalations and they did all this stuff. And it ended up on my desk. Like, you're the dispute resolution guy, go solve this. So I called the buyer, who was the complainant, who had just been pursuing this so relentlessly about this part, and it had gotten so personal. And I just spent an hour with her, and I said, tell me from the beginning what happened. And she just went through in gory detail about everything that this person had said and all the offenses and all. And we're talking about like maybe a $230 muffler on a motorcycle. So she goes through all this, and I was like, oh my gosh, wow. And then what did they do? Oh my. And I was like, wow, if that happened to me, I would be so frustrated. Like, I can't even imagine. And I get to the end of it, she finishes the story, and I said, well, what do you want to do? And she said, you know what? It's fine. Just cancel the case, right? I don't need any money. I just wanted somebody to listen to me. No one was listening to me, and you just listened to me, so it's done. And is an AI ever going to be able to do that? Is an AI ever going to say, you know what? It's not really a big issue. Or I've had cases where the parties go after each other for years and they come in and look, just buy me a sandwich and we'll work it out. Because I think people are weird. We're confusing. We're erratic. We make strange decisions. We're motivated by things that are not quantifiable. And we need to maintain the possibility of resolving disputes on that basis, and not just say, okay, let's all throw it into a super powerful math engine and figure out, $136.28. So I agree with you 100% on that count, Dan. I'm doing too much talking here. I need to shut up. That's a challenge for me, is shutting up. But we have so many other smart people in this session. What are your thoughts about this? Andrea, I see you nodding. Your video's on, so I'm tempted to cold call you. But if you have any thoughts, but Jeff, I don't know, what are your thoughts as well?
Sure. Thanks, Colin. Hi, everybody. I do have some thoughts about this, mostly coming at it from having mediated in the public sector and in the civil rights space for the last 3 years as a concentration. And then picking up on my previous experience back in the 90s working with eBay and techs. Mm-hmm. I'm excited to see where AI is going to take us to solve the chunky math problems and some of the decisions and analysis that can be helpful to me as a mediator and to my parties, if that's the avenue they want to go. I'm concerned that we would not, in our enthusiasm to adopt these things in a system, especially at a large scale organization, that we will overlook all the opportunities there is for bias. Implicitly so, and that is part of the training that we would do for people who are going to engage with the public in these platforms using these tools. We would make sure to do rigorous analysis and training.
Sure, auditing.
Implement that. It's kind of exciting to think that My role as a mediator, the one that can see and hear and understand the subtext, the things that are communicated not in text and not necessarily verbally, but in being part of that mediator who can, part of my role is to figure out what it is they are feeling unheard about in order to generate those other possible solutions. If there can be a role for AI in that without doing harm, or injecting bias, I'm kind of wrapping my head around a lot of things. So this is sort of a riff on a lot of stuff, but
no, that's actually something we've been talking about at ODR.com. Actually,
yeah.
Ron, who's my chief innovation officer, he actually was playing with AIs where someone would make a statement in a mediation about what their concerns are, and then you ask the counterparty to summarize what what their concerns are back to them, and then the AI could actually compare the two and say, what did they miss? It's like, well, actually, one of the big things that the first person said is a concern for them is this, and in your summary, you didn't address that. And as a mediator, when you call that out, it can seem a little bit accusatory. But if the fourth party is doing this, it's like, well, hey, you didn't even mention this. Oh yeah, that's interesting. Why didn't you mention this? Why wasn't that more of a factor? And that gets it. That gets to what you were saying, I think, also, trying to make people hear each other. Yeah.
Well, and people in conflict don't start off typically rational, right? So all the analysis and all the data points that are being put forth by the technology and then communicated perhaps by the mediator,
right?
Kind of need us as the conduit to figure out how to overcome the fact that people, if you're going to, that people are messy and they aren't thinking rationally at that point. Data is rational. People are not.
Well, and there's that professor at the University of Maryland, Robert Condlin, who talks about how ODR systems often fall into the little boxes fallacy, where you take every dispute and you say, well, just check the boxes that describe your dispute. That's not the way people experience dispute. I'm angry. They made me. It's not. I can't just click boxes that rationally say this is what it is. You're missing the bulk of my lived experience. So we have to build systems that match the human emotions in it as well. Yeah.
How we partner up with the fourth party, I'm still figuring that out. Will be for a long time.
Yeah, you and me both. Jeff, do you have any thoughts?
You talking to me?
Yeah, I cold called you, but Mehaz made a point as well that we can go to. Yeah.
I think we have to, I'm using the technology on a pretty regular basis, but just so that I can become familiar with it and so that I can see how it helps. And I've found after the course I took with you and Claire, I started looking for other places where folks are actually like yourself. You're trying to take your knowledge base and work with an AI program so that the AI program begins to start generating thoughts and ideas that might be coming from from Mediate, from your world. And I see some of that beginning to develop, and to the extent that it is, it's getting pretty powerful because it tends to mimic a lot of the information that would be coming from a particular source. So I think we're at a stage where, I don't see AI replacing anything, but somewhere along the way, when law firms and others start putting chatbots on their homepages, as Claire was saying in your program, and people can say, well, I have this dispute, and they type it into the chatbot, and they get an answer back from the chatbot. The clients are going to begin asking us, well, do you use it? When that begins to happen, I think the dynamic shifts. And I think we're away, younger people, I suspect we're not having to think about that as much just yet, but the people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who are mediating disputes, I think it's still a person-to-person type of thing, though they're going to get familiar with the chatbots over time. So I think we just have to use them, see how they save us time and money, and that's what I'm doing. I'm at that stage.
Yeah. Well, it makes me want to pass the virtual hat to take up a collection to fund Ayelet's rerunning of her experiment from 10 years ago, because I'm curious to see how the numbers might have changed. It's interesting because I'm not a really evaluative guy. I'm a facilitative mediator, but I'm putting more time and energy into the evaluative side. And I thought that was an intriguing result that she found, that people like technology, or they appreciate the role of technology in a facilitative context, maybe more so than in an evaluative context. And I wonder if attitudes on that had changed. It seems like such an important question. But so Ayelet, I don't know, you just came off of, yeah, do you have thoughts about that?
I'm here all the time listening. So I'm not sure it's about the evaluative capacity, right? Because you can provide evaluative insights without determining the outcome of the case.
Sure.
I think it's about the control of the parties, and it's about, you know, our willingness to submit ourselves to the decisions of an algorithm. And I think the higher the stakes, the more difficult it's going to be. And a key point here is the accountability. I think we still feel like a human decision maker is more accountable to us than an AI decision maker. And so having some options to ensure accountability, I think will be, you know, a deal breaker for a greater use of AI in it's not just evaluative capacities, but in, you know, deal breaking capacities.
Well, yeah, it's interesting too. I know Jim just came on video as well. He's long been saying to me he's more optimistic about the ability for AI to play a role in the mediation process than the arbitration process, because you can have a fourth party provide an evaluative role, but a non-binding evaluative role in a mediation, and then it's advisory to the parties, and then they still retain control because they own the eventual outcome.
Right.
So
Right.
I think it's interesting that maybe we're going to welcome the role of these AIs as sort of nudgers and shapers, but we don't just want to submit to them. We don't want to give the ultimate authority to them. So if they're going to help us be at our best, and then we still get to decide what the eventual outcome is, maybe we'll be happier with them playing that role than saying, okay, well, here's all my information, all-seeing eye, tell me what the right outcome is.
Well, I mean, I think it's also about, you know, demarcating the role and identifying what kind of tasks, you know, AIs, you know, might be better than humans, as you suggested earlier. So if we're thinking about AI in medicine, right, I mean, we may want you know, the robotic arm of the surgeon to be controlled by a very accurate, stable AI software, but, you know, maybe for the diagnosis or for, you know, like giving the go action command, right? We want to have a doctor there that has more discretion, or that's supervising the work of that robotic arm, so that we make sure that it's, you know, responds to change. So I mean, we're gonna have to have more nuance than you know, sort of across the board statements about how AI can
I'm
be
fine
used.
with the autopilot flying my 777, but I want a pilot in the chair just in case. Jim, did you have a thought about that?
Yeah, you know, context is important, and the mediation context, I think, makes AI much more resilient and easy because the folks retain decision-making power. And so ideas that are generated by whomever, the mediator, AI, a friend, what have you, you know, they're all worthy of consideration. The other thing that's kind of cool about a couple things about mediation is you can really bring in the mediative component at any point in the conversation, the dispute. It's not as formal of a process as a due process arbitration. So, and I think that's going to be something that will happen in the future, is folks will make as much progress as they can on their own, and then they'll hit that, hey, we really need a mediator help to get across the goal line. And so for me, it's a wonderful way of introducing, if you will, wisdom or possibility into the discussion. And the super cool thing about mediation is I think there's an intrinsic attraction to the optimization of arrangements to get everybody as much substantive satisfaction as they can, and to work on their perceptions of fairness as well. But of course, if they're not satisfied, they just say no, and they don't suffer. Presumably it's confidential, blah, blah. Arbitration is very different, I think, because you're asking for a decision, and you know the odds are there's a very good chance of one side being unhappy with that decision. And so one thing I think is going to be true is there will need to be a human appeal process, that if somebody's really unhappy, that there would be a way of getting the human attention to it, would be one suggestion. The other thing I would think we'll start to see more and more is kind of that European ombuds model, where the online robot, it might be an ombuds robot, would have the ability to listen and to reflect a possible solution, and that solution would be binding on the entity or organization, but not necessarily on the consumer.
Yeah, so
it
they
would
could
be kind
pursue
of,
redress. Yeah.
yeah. So
like
I
that.
think that's what we're going to see more and more, is that large entities, including governmental entities, will set boundaries for what they think is reasonable to just approve automatically. And if they can get the dispute resolved in that way, they'll do it.
Well, that gets back to Leah's point about regulation. I will say one of the things that worries me about the fourth party in mediation is, say you have two parties and they're negotiating the sale of a car, and they go back and forth and back and forth, and they get to one party says, I'm willing to pay 5,000. The other party's like, no, I want 5,500. They just can't get an agreement. They say, why don't we ask the fourth party what it thinks? What do you think the best sale price would be? And then the fourth party says, that car's not worth anything more than $3,000. And you're like, wait, what? You know? And then the guy that was going to get $5,000 is like, wait a minute, what just happened here? You know, because there could be some objective thing that the fourth party would insert. Or do we say to the fourth party, hey, don't tell them what you really think, only focus on the two offers that got on the table, and, you know, make a decision between that. So,
Colin,
yeah.
Don't you think particularly that we're going to run into people that have already been using AI for their own exploration of
yeah, sure.
And yeah, so I mean, there's no way we can screen it out. The question is whether we have AI tools that would be helpful to us as folks offering and sponsoring a mediative process,
Right.
or helpful perhaps for large volume, low value disputes and the like. But it's here already. I'm even looking at the bottom of Zoom now for my AI companion.
I know. Yeah, it's going to be everywhere. It's going to be on the watch. It's going to be on the phone. Jeff, I saw you put your hand up. Did you say something? You wanted to say something?
It's just pretty much what Jim is saying. If you think about the adoption of technology along the way, at least from the legal profession standpoint, the clients drove it, not the lawyers didn't drive it. The clients were always the ones who finally said to the law firm, get the, you know, are you using this? Well, back in the early days, the fax machine, that was an early one, but, you know, it was the clients are going to drive it. They're going to be using these. It's same thing in the medical profession. You know, the people are going into the doctor's office and they've been on, you know, WebMD and all the rest of that beforehand. So that's going to take a little bit of time to work its way through. But once it's there, we need to be on top of it. And then how we integrate it into an actual mediation arbitration practice, I think that's still up for grabs.
Absolutely. Well, I'm acknowledging we're at time here. You know, I wonder if there was some bar association conference back in 1986 where they had a knockdown, drag out conversation about the ethics of using fax machines in the law. You know, is this gonna disrupt everything? This is gonna mess everything up. So anyway, but let me go back to Ayelet and Dan. Do you have any final comments you want to make before we wrap up?
Please.
I mean, go ahead, Dan.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that no final points here, except again emphasizing that I hope that in future conferences we're going to have panels like this that are more contextualized, so that we will start to have that drill down conversation about specific guardrails and principles that could guide the use of AI in specific contexts and specific types of AI, specific types of disputes, specific types of processes, because I think that's where the conversation needs to move forward to.
Absolutely.
Well, I would agree with that completely. And the exciting thing to me is the development of AI systems that are targeted to specific areas that are more responsive, put it that way. But I guess the last thing I would say is that what I'm looking forward to is figuring out what we don't know yet. We've been talking about a lot of problems that we can identify now, things that we can worry about now. The things that we're going to encounter as we integrate this into the way we do business, we're not thinking about now, because it's like every other process. You begin it and you think you know where it's going, but there are going to be some surprises along the way. And I'm kind of looking forward to figuring out what those are.
Confuse the algorithm, as Ben would say. Well, thank you very much, Ayelet and Dan. Thank you, everyone, for this great conversation. This was really fun, but I do urge you to jump over to the next session in Cyberweek, which is our student panel that Leah is administering. So Thank you for taking the time today, and hope to see you all through the rest of Cyber Week.